Welcome, gentle soul, to another quiet visit with the past. In tonight's episode, we'll step into another world, familiar in its humanity, yet distant in time. Maybe you're listening as your thoughts begin to slow, or perhaps you're already resting with heavy eyes. However you've found your way here, I'm thankful. I'd love to know where you're listening from and what time of day it is for you. The idea of this quiet story floating across the world always makes me smile. If these bedtime journeys through history bring you calm, don't forget to subscribe. There are so many more peaceful nights ahead. What I'm about to show you isn't just a history lesson about old buildings. This is the untold story of how America's greatest city became a living nightmare for hundreds of thousands of immigrants who came seeking the American dream, only to find themselves trapped in what can only be described as human warehouses. By the end of this video, you'll understand exactly how New York's tenement system became one of the most brutal examples of exploitation in American history, and why the stories of the people who lived there reveal truths about inequality that still echo today. But before we dive into the horror of tenement life, let me give you some context that will make everything else make sense. During the Gilded Age, roughly from 1870 to 1900, New York City was experiencing the most rapid population explosion in its history. Between 1880 and 1890 alone, the city's population jumped from 1.5 million to 2.5 million people. Most of these new arrivals were immigrants from Ireland, Germany, Italy, and Eastern Europe, fleeing poverty, famine, and persecution in their home countries. Here's where it gets interesting, though. While these immigrants were pouring into the city by the thousands every single week, the amount of available housing wasn't growing nearly fast enough to accommodate them. Manhattan is an island, remember, so there's only so much space to build. The wealthy had already claimed the best neighborhoods, and the middle class occupied decent housing further from the city center. That left one option for the poor: pack as many people as possible into the smallest spaces imaginable and charge them rent they could barely afford. Enter the tenement landlords, some of the most ruthless profiteers you've never heard of. These weren't just greedy businessmen. They were architects of human misery who discovered they could make enormous profits by subdividing buildings into tiny rooms and cramming families into spaces that were never meant for human habitation. A single building that might have housed one wealthy family was carved up into dozens of apartments, each one packed with entire families, boarders, and anyone else who could scrape together enough money for rent. Let me paint you a picture of what life looked like inside these buildings through the story of Maria Benedetto, a real woman who arrived in New York from Sicily in 1885. Maria stepped off the boat at Castle Garden with her 3 young children, carrying everything she owned in a single cloth bundle. Her husband Giuseppe had come to America 2 years earlier, working construction during the day and sleeping in a cellar with 8 other men at night, saving every penny to bring his family over. When Maria finally reunited with Giuseppe, their new home was a 10 by 12-foot room on the 4th floor of a tenement on the Lower East Side. This single room served as bedroom, kitchen, living room, and workspace for the entire family. They shared this space with 2 male boarders who paid Giuseppe $3 a month each to sleep on the floor, money the family desperately needed to make rent. The room had one tiny window that faced directly into another tenement building just 3 feet away, so close that Maria could reach out and touch the brick wall across the alley. But here's what makes Maria's story even more heartbreaking. Her situation was actually considered relatively good by tenement standards. At least her family had their own room. Thousands of other families were subdividing their already tiny spaces even further, hanging sheets from the ceiling to create separate sleeping areas, or taking turns using the same bed in shifts. Some families rented out floor space to strangers who would sleep in hallways, closets, or even under staircases. The buildings themselves were architectural nightmares designed to maximize profit while ignoring basic human needs. Most tenements were built on standard New York lots that were 25 feet wide and 100 feet deep. Developers would construct buildings that covered nearly the entire lot, leaving almost no space for courtyards or ventilation. The result was a layout that became known as the dumbbell tenement because of its shape when viewed from above. Narrow in the middle, with bulges at the front and back. Picture walking into one of these buildings. You'd enter through a narrow hallway that was usually completely dark, even in the middle of the day. There were no windows in these hallways, and gas lighting was considered too expensive and dangerous for common areas. You'd feel your way along walls that were often damp with condensation and covered in a film of soot from the building's coal-burning stoves. The smell would be overwhelming, a mixture of cooking food, unwashed bodies, chamber pots, and whatever was rotting in the building's inadequate garbage storage. As you climbed the rickety wooden stairs, you'd notice that each floor was divided into 4 apartments, 2 facing the street and 2 facing the backyard. But calling them apartments is generous. These were really just collections of tiny rooms, most of them windowless, connected by narrow hallways that were somehow even darker than the main stairwell. The apartments facing the street were considered premium units because they had actual windows, though those windows looked out onto streets that were often just as crowded and polluted as the buildings themselves. The rear apartments were where the truly desperate lived. These units got their only light and air from something called an air shaft, a narrow opening in the center of the building that was supposed to provide ventilation. In reality, these air shafts became garbage chutes, sewers, and echo chambers that amplified every sound in the building. Residents would throw their trash, empty their chamber pots, and dump their dirty water down these shafts, creating a festering column of waste that rose from the basement to the roof. Let me tell you about Giovanni Rossi, an Italian immigrant who lived in one of these rear apartments with his wife and 4 children. Giovanni worked as a rag picker, spending 12 hours a day collecting scraps of cloth, paper, and metal from the city's garbage to sell to recycling dealers. His wife Teresa took in piecework, sewing garments for a clothing manufacturer who paid her 8 cents for every dozen shirts she completed. Working from dawn until midnight, Teresa could finish maybe 3 dozen shirts a day on a good day, earning her 24 cents for nearly 18 hours of labor. The Rossi family's apartment consisted of 2 rooms, connected by a doorway with no door. The front room served as Teresa's workspace during the day, filled with piles of fabric and the sewing machine Giovanni had bought on credit. At night, they would clear away the work materials and roll out thin mattresses for the children to sleep on the floor. The back room was where Giovanni and Teresa slept, along with their baby daughter. This room's only source of light and air was a window that opened onto the air shaft, which meant it was in perpetual twilight and filled with the stench rising from below. But the Rossi family's struggles went far beyond cram as the tenement house disease. The combination of poor ventilation, malpaired living conditions. Like most tenement residents, they were constantly battling diseases that spread rapidly. Osis was so common in tenements that it was known through the overcrowded buildings. Tubercle nutrition and close quarters created perfect conditions for the bacteria to spread from person to person. Entire families would be wiped out within months of the first person showing symptoms. Cholera outbreaks were another constant threat. The tenement's primitive sanitation systems couldn't handle the waste produced by hundreds of people living in a single building. Many buildings had just 1 or 2 toilets in the basement or backyard, shared by dozens of families. These facilities were rarely cleaned and often overflowed, contaminating the building's water supply and creating breeding grounds for disease-carrying insects and rats. The children suffered the most. Infant mortality rates in tenement districts were staggering. In some neighborhoods, more than 1 in 4 babies died before their first birthday. Those who survived faced malnutrition, stunted growth, and constant exposure to dangers that would be unthinkable today. Children as young as 5 or 6 were sent to work in factories or on the streets, contributing whatever meager wages they could earn to help their families survive. Teresa and Giovanni's oldest son, Antonio, was 8 years old when he started working at a glass factory carrying hot bottles from the furnaces to cooling racks for 10 cents a day. His hands were constantly burned, his lungs filled with glass dust, and his childhood essentially ended before it had really begun. But the family needed those 10 cents. It was the difference between eating dinner and going to bed hungry. The tenement system wasn't just about housing, it was an entire ecosystem of exploitation that trapped families in cycles of poverty that were nearly impossible to escape. Landlords charged whatever the market would bear, knowing that desperate families had no other options. They rarely made repairs, ignored building codes that barely existed anyway, and evicted tenants who complained about conditions. The buildings deteriorated rapidly under the strain of overcrowding. But as long as people kept paying rent, there was no incentive to improve anything. What made the situation even more tragic was that many of these immigrants had been skilled craftsmen, farmers, or small business owners in their home countries. Giuseppe Benedetto had been a stonemason in Sicily, capable of creating beautiful architectural details that still grace buildings across Italy today. But in New York, language barriers, discrimination, and the desperate need for immediate income forced him into unskilled construction work that barely paid enough to keep his family alive. The contrast between the lives of tenement dwellers and the wealthy elite living just a few miles away was stark and intentional. While families like the Benedettos and Rossis struggled to afford bread and coal for heating, New York's millionaires were building palatial mansions on Fifth Avenue, complete with ballrooms, conservatories, and armies of servants. The Gilded Age earned its name because of this thin veneer of gold covering a foundation of human suffering. But what's most important to understand is that this wasn't an accident or an unfortunate side effect of rapid growth. The tenement system was a deliberate creation of an economic structure that prioritized profit over human dignity. Every aspect of tenement life, from the building design to the rental practices to the working conditions that kept families trapped in poverty, was designed to extract maximum value from human desperation. The wealthy didn't just ignore this suffering, they actively profited from it. Many of New York's most respected families, the ones whose names still grace museums and universities today, owned tenement properties. They hired property managers to collect rent and handle complaints, so they never had to see the conditions firsthand. These absentee landlords could maintain their refined social circles while extracting wealth from human misery, creating a perfect system of plausible deniability. Let me introduce you to another family whose story reveals just how deep this exploitation ran. Patrick O'Sullivan arrived in New York from County Cork, Ireland, in 1887, fleeing the economic devastation that followed years of failed potato crops. Patrick was a proud man who had worked his own small farm back home, but in New York, the only work he could find was loading cargo on the docks for 12 hours a day, 6 days a week. The O'Sullivan family, Patrick, his wife Bridget, and their 5 children, crowded into a single room in a tenement on the notorious Mulberry Street. Their building was owned by William Henderson, a respected member of New York society, who lived in a mansion on the Upper East Side and never set foot in his tenement properties. Henderson employed a man named Murphy to collect rent and manage the building, paying him a commission that incentivized cramming as many people as possible into every available space. Patrick paid Murphy $14 a month for that single room, which represented nearly half of his total earnings. But here's the cruel mathematics of tenement life. Even though Patrick was paying what seemed like reasonable rent for one room, Murphy was collecting rent from 43 separate families in that building. The total monthly income from that single tenement was over $500, while Henderson's expenses for maintenance, taxes, and Murphy's commission came to less than $100. The remaining $400 went straight into Henderson's pocket, month after month, year after year. Bridget O'Sullivan tried to supplement Patrick's income by taking in laundry, but the tenement's water situation made even this backbreaking work nearly impossible. The building had one water spigot in the basement that served all 43 families. Bridget would have to carry heavy buckets of water up 4 flights of stairs multiple times a day, competing with dozens of other women for access to that single tap. The water itself was often contaminated. The city's water system couldn't keep up with the demand, and broken pipes frequently mixed drinking water with sewage. On laundry day, Bridget would rise at 4 in the morning to claim space around the water spigot before the other women arrived. She'd scrub clothes on a washboard in the building's dank basement, breathing air thick with coal dust and the smell of human waste from the overflowing toilets nearby. After washing, she'd carry the wet laundry back up 4 flights to hang it in their room, since the building had no proper drying facilities. The clothes would take days to dry in the humid, poorly ventilated space, often developing mildew before they were completely clean. For all this work, hauling water, scrubbing clothes, and dealing with angry customers whose garments came back dirtier than when they started, Bridget might earn $3 or $4 a month, but even that meager income was essential. Without it, the O'Sullivan family would have joined the thousands of New Yorkers sleeping in doorways, under bridges, or in the city's overcrowded public shelters. The children in tenement families faced choices that no child should ever have to make. Mary O'Sullivan, Patrick and Bridget's 12-year-old daughter, was torn between helping her mother with the laundry business and attending the overcrowded public school 6 blocks away. The school was supposed to be free, but families had to provide their own books, paper, and pencils, expenses the O'Sullivans could rarely afford. More importantly, Mary's help with the laundry could earn the family an extra 50 cents a week, money that might mean the difference between eating meat once a week or going without it entirely. Most weeks, necessity won out over education. Mary would spend her days in the basement with her mother, her small hands growing raw from the harsh lye soap and cold water. She learned arithmetic by counting dirty shirts and geography by listening to her mother's stories about the green hills of Ireland. But she never learned to read well, and by the time she turned 14, her formal education was essentially over. The youngest O'Sullivan children faced even grimmer prospects. 7-year-old Timothy had developed a persistent cough that kept the entire family awake at night. Bridget knew he needed medical attention, but a visit to the doctor cost more than Patrick earned in 2 days. The free clinic at Bellevue Hospital meant waiting in line for hours with hundreds of other sick people, often to be turned away at the end of the day when the doctors ran out of time. So Timothy's cough got worse. His small body grew thinner as the persistent illness robbed him of appetite and energy. The whole family watched helplessly as their youngest member struggled to breathe in air that was already thick with smoke, dust, and the exhalations of dozens of other people. This wasn't just neglect. This was a system that had calculated that Timothy's life was worth less than the cost of proper medical care. Winter brought its own special torments to tenement families. The O'Sullivans' room had no heat source, except for a small coal-burning stove that shared a chimney with 3 other apartments. Coal was expensive, and families had to choose between heating their homes and buying food. Most chose a compromise that satisfied neither need. They'd burn just enough coal to prevent freezing while wearing every piece of clothing they owned inside their rooms. But even this wasn't enough during the brutal winter of 1888, when temperatures dropped below 0 for weeks at a time. The O'Sullivan family huddled together on their single bed, sharing thin blankets that had been patched so many times they were more patches than original fabric. Ice formed on the inside of their windows, and water left in buckets overnight would freeze solid. Patrick's hands became so numb from the cold that he could barely grip the ropes and hooks he needed for his dock work. But missing even 1 day of labor meant his family wouldn't eat that evening. The cold affected every aspect of tenement life. Families burned furniture, books, and anything else combustible to stay warm. The primitive stoves and shared chimneys created constant fire hazards. Tenement fires were so common that newspapers stopped reporting on them unless they killed more than a dozen people. Smoke inhalation joined tuberculosis, cholera, and malnutrition as leading causes of death in these overcrowded buildings. Yet even in the depths of winter, the rent was due every month. Murphy would climb those dark stairs every first of the month, knocking on doors and demanding payment from families who were choosing between heat and food. Families who couldn't pay faced immediate eviction, regardless of the weather or the health of their children. The city's shelters were overflowing, and being evicted during winter was often a death sentence. This is where the true cruelty of the tenement system becomes clear. It wasn't just about poor housing, it was about creating a captive population that had no choice but to accept whatever conditions were imposed on them. Patrick O'Sullivan couldn't demand better living conditions because dozens of other desperate families were waiting to take his place. Bridget couldn't refuse laundry work that paid starvation wages because no other work was available to women in her situation. Their children couldn't stay in school because the family needed every penny they could earn just to survive. The tenement landlords understood this dynamic perfectly. They knew that desperation eliminated choice, and without choice, people would endure almost anything. So the buildings got more crowded, the rent kept rising, and the conditions kept deteriorating because the system worked exactly as designed. Not to house people, but to extract maximum profit from human need. What's most heartbreaking about stories like the O'Sullivans is how common they were. Their struggles weren't exceptional or dramatic. They were the everyday reality for hundreds of thousands of families across New York City. Every tenement building held dozens of similar stories, each family fighting their own private battle against poverty, disease, and despair, while the city's elites celebrated the prosperity of the Gilded Age just miles away. The psychological toll of tenement life was as devastating as the physical hardships. Imagine being Patrick O'Sullivan, a man who had owned land and made his own decisions back in Ireland, now reduced to begging Murphy for an extra week to pay rent. Picture Bridget, who had run her own household with pride and dignity, now competing with neighbours for access to a single water tap in a basement that reeked of human waste. The children absorbed these lessons in powerlessness from the moment they could walk. They watched their parents shrink a little more each day, saw dignity slowly drain from faces that had once held hope. Little Mary O'Sullivan learned not to ask for things she wanted because she understood, even at 12, that wanting something her family couldn't afford only added to her mother's pain. She learned to make herself smaller, quieter, less of a burden in a world that had already decided she was worth very little. This crushing of human spirit wasn't an accidental byproduct of overcrowding. It was a necessary component of the system. Broken people don't organize. Desperate people don't demand better conditions. Families focused on daily survival don't have energy left to challenge the structures keeping them trapped. The tenement system didn't just warehouse bodies, it manufactured hopelessness on an industrial scale. But let me tell you about someone who refused to be broken. Her name was Rose Friedman, and she arrived in New York from a small village in Poland in 1892 with her parents and 3 younger siblings. Rose was 16 when her family crowded into 2 rooms on the 5th floor of a tenement on Hester Street, in the heart of what would become known as the most densely populated neighborhood in the world. The Friedman family's building housed over 200 people across 6 floors. Their apartment consisted of a front room that faced the street and a back room that opened onto one of those fetid air shafts I described earlier. Rose's parents, Samuel and Rachel, took the back room with the baby, while Rose shared the front room with her 2 younger brothers, sleeping on mattresses that were rolled up each morning to make space for the sewing machine that would dominate their days. Samuel Friedman had been a Hebrew teacher back in Poland, a respected position that had provided his family with a modest but comfortable life. In New York, his religious education and inability to speak English fluently made him nearly unemployable. After weeks of searching, he found work in a sweatshop that manufactured men's coats, earning $8 a week for 12-hour days in a windowless room filled with fabric dust and the constant noise of industrial sewing machines. But it was Rose who truly understood how the system worked. While her father struggled with the loss of his former status, and her mother battled depression that seemed to deepen with each passing month, Rose saw opportunity hidden within the exploitation. The garment industry that was destroying her father's health also offered something previous generations of poor immigrants had never had: the chance for a young woman to earn her own wages. Rose found work at the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory, one of the largest garment manufacturers in the city. The factory occupied the top 3 floors of a 10-story building, and Rose joined nearly 500 other young women who spent their days hunched over sewing machines, turning out the fashionable blouses that middle-class women across America were beginning to demand. The work was repetitive and exhausting, the conditions dangerous, but Rose earned $6 a week, not much less than her father, despite being half his age. What made Rose different wasn't her wages, though. It was what she chose to do with her rare moments of freedom. While most tenement dwellers collapsed into bed after their 12-hour work days, Rose would climb one more flight of stairs to the building's roof. There, surrounded by a forest of similar tenements stretching in every direction, she would practice reading English using newspapers she collected from the streets. Rose had figured out something that the tenement system hoped she never would. That knowledge was the only ladder out of the trap. Every evening, no matter how exhausted she felt, she would sound out words by the dim light of a candle stub, building her vocabulary one painful syllable at a time. She started with the headlines, then moved to advertisements, eventually working her way through entire articles about politics, business, and social issues that affected her life directly. The view from that rooftop revealed the full scope of the tenement district in ways that were impossible to grasp from street level. Looking down, Rose could see into the courtyards where children played among garbage and human waste. She could observe the constant flow of people moving between buildings, workers heading to and from factories, peddlers carrying their goods through narrow alleys, women hauling water and laundry up and down endless flights of stairs. But looking out toward the horizon, Rose could also see the spires of churches in wealthier neighborhoods, the masts of ships in the harbor, and the construction cranes building new skyscrapers that would house the offices and stores where better-paid workers spent their days. The city wasn't just the tenement district. It was a vast machine with many different parts, and Rose was determined to understand how she might move from one part to another. This perspective gave Rose something that most of her neighbors lacked: context. She began to understand that her family's suffering wasn't the result of personal failings or bad luck, but rather the predictable outcome of a system designed to extract maximum value from human desperation. The factory owners who paid her $6 a week were selling the blouses she made for 20 times that amount. The landlord who collected $14 a month from her family was pulling in hundreds of dollars from their single building while spending almost nothing on maintenance or improvements. Rose started talking to other young women at the factory about what she was learning. During their brief lunch breaks, huddled together in the factory's stairwell, she would share articles she had read about working conditions in other cities, about labor organizers who were fighting for shorter hours and better wages, about women in other countries who had won the right to vote and participate in decisions that affected their lives. These conversations were dangerous. The factory foreman had made it clear that any talk of organizing or unions would result in immediate dismissal, and being fired meant not just personal hardship, but potential disaster for entire families who depended on those wages. But Rose understood something that the foreman and factory owners didn't: that the system's strength was also its weakness. It depended on keeping workers isolated and desperate. But when hundreds of young women worked side by side every day, complete isolation became impossible. The breaking point came during the summer of 1895, when a heat wave settled over New York City for 3 weeks straight. The factory's top floors, with their large windows facing south, became unbearable furnaces where temperatures reached over 100 degrees. The heavy fabric and the heat from the sewing machines made conditions even worse. Women began fainting at their workstations, but the factory owners refused to install fans or allow more frequent breaks, because both would reduce productivity. When Sarah Goldstein, a 19-year-old who worked at the machine next to Rose, collapsed and didn't regain consciousness for several minutes, Rose made a decision that would change not just her own life, but the lives of hundreds of other young women. She stood up at her sewing machine and announced that she was going home, and that anyone who wanted to join her was welcome to do so. The factory floor fell silent except for the whir of sewing machines operated by women who were too frightened to stop working. For a moment, Rose thought she had miscalculated, that her months of careful conversations hadn't built the solidarity she hoped for. Then Sarah Goldstein, still pale and shaky from her collapse, pushed back from her machine and stood up. Within minutes, nearly half the women on the floor had joined them, walking out of the factory together in the first spontaneous strike in the building's history. The strike lasted only 2 days before the women were forced to return to work by economic necessity, but those 2 days revealed possibilities that hadn't existed before. The factory owners, faced with the prospect of missing delivery deadlines, had agreed to install fans and allow additional water breaks during heat waves. More importantly, the women had discovered that collective action could produce results that individual complaints never could. But the real change was in Rose herself. The strike had shown her that the tenement system's greatest weakness was its dependence on isolation and hopelessness. When people understood that their individual struggles were part of a larger pattern of exploitation, when they realized they weren't alone in their suffering, the system's control began to weaken. Rose began organizing in earnest. She used her evening reading sessions to study labor law and workers' rights. She reached out to settlement house workers and social reformers who were beginning to document tenement conditions. Most importantly, she started building networks that connected women across different factories and different tenement districts, creating lines of communication that the factory owners couldn't control or monitor. The work was slow and often frustrating. Many women were too frightened of losing their jobs to participate openly in organizing efforts. Others were so exhausted by the demands of work and family that they had no energy left for meetings or demonstrations. The constant threat of eviction and homelessness made any form of resistance feel impossibly risky. But Rose had learned something crucial during her years in the tenements: that small changes, accumulated over time, could produce dramatic results. Just as she had built her English vocabulary one word at a time, she built her organization one conversation at a time, one woman at a time, one small victory at a time. The breakthrough came in 1897, when Rose helped coordinate a strike that involved over 3,000 garment workers across dozens of factories. The strike lasted for 6 weeks and ultimately won shorter working hours, improved ventilation, and modest wage increases for thousands of women. More importantly, it established the principle that workers had the right to organize, and that their collective voice could force even powerful employers to negotiate. But Rose's story illustrates something even more significant about tenement life: that the system's attempts to crush human spirit sometimes produced exactly the opposite result. The very conditions that were designed to keep people desperate and isolated sometimes forged bonds of solidarity that proved impossible to break. The shared suffering that was supposed to make people compete against each other for scraps sometimes taught them that their real enemies weren't each other, but the structures that kept them all trapped. This wasn't true for everyone, of course. For every Rose Friedman who found ways to fight back, there were dozens of families like the O'Sullivans who remained trapped in cycles of poverty and desperation. The system was designed to ensure that individual success stories wouldn't threaten the overall structure of exploitation. A few people might climb out of the tenements, but the tenements themselves would remain, ready to house the next wave of desperate families. The Catholic Church played a complex role in tenement districts, offering both comfort and control to immigrant families struggling to survive. For Irish families like the O'Sullivans, Sunday Mass at St. Patrick's Cathedral provided one of the few respites from the grinding poverty of daily life. The church was a place where Patrick could remember his dignity, where Bridget could find community with other women facing similar struggles, where their children could see beauty and grandeur that didn't exist in their cramped tenement room. Father Michael O'Brien, the priest who served the Lower East Side parishes, understood the delicate balance his role required. On one hand, he genuinely cared for the suffering families in his congregation and worked tirelessly to provide what aid he could, organizing soup kitchens, negotiating with landlords for repairs, even occasionally paying rent for families facing eviction. On the other hand, he knew that his church's survival depended on not challenging the fundamental structures that created the poverty he was trying to alleviate. Father O'Brien's Sunday sermons walked this careful line. He preached about the dignity of honest work, the importance of family, and the promise of heavenly rewards for earthly suffering. He encouraged his parishioners to accept their hardships with grace and to focus on spiritual rather than material improvement. This message provided genuine comfort to families who had few other sources of hope, but it also served the interests of the wealthy Catholics who funded the church and who preferred that the poor remain patient rather than demanding. The Jewish families in the tenements faced different challenges and found different sources of community. The Orthodox synagogues that served families like the Friedmans provided not just spiritual guidance, but also practical support systems that helped new immigrants navigate the complexities of American life. Rabbi Isaac Goldstein, who led the congregation on Rivington Street, spoke fluent English and helped families like the Friedmans understand legal documents, negotiate with employers, and access city services. But the synagogue also served as a reminder of how much had been lost in the journey to America. The elaborate religious observances that had structured daily life in the old country became nearly impossible to maintain in the tenements. Keeping kosher was difficult when families could barely afford food at all. Observing the Sabbath was impossible when missing a day of work meant not being able to pay rent. The rich traditions that had sustained Jewish communities for centuries began to fragment under the pressure of economic necessity. For families from Italy, like the Benedettos, the tenement experience was complicated by the clash between their rural agricultural background and the industrial urban environment they now faced. Giuseppe had grown up understanding the rhythms of planting and harvest, the importance of land ownership, and the extended family networks that provided security in times of hardship. In New York, none of these familiar structures existed. The Italian families often clustered together in specific tenement buildings, trying to recreate some sense of community in an alien environment. Maria Benedetto would spend her evenings on the front stoop with other Italian women, sharing gossip from the old country, recipes adapted to American ingredients, and strategies for dealing with landlords and factory foremen who seemed to view them as barely human. These ethnic communities provided crucial support, but they also created new forms of isolation. Language barriers made it difficult for recent immigrants to communicate with members of other ethnic groups, even when they lived in the same building. Competition for jobs often pitted different immigrant groups against each other, as factory owners discovered they could keep wages low by encouraging ethnic divisions among their workers. The children caught between worlds faced perhaps the most difficult challenges of all. They learned English in school and on the streets, becoming interpreters for parents who remained trapped by language barriers. They absorbed American customs and ambitions that often conflicted with the traditions their families were trying to preserve. They saw opportunities that their parents couldn't imagine, but also understood the harsh realities that made most of those opportunities impossible to grasp. 10-year-old Antonio Benedetto found himself translating not just languages, but entire world views as he moved between his family's tenement room and the American school 6 blocks away. At home, he spoke Italian and helped his father understand the contracts and legal documents that seemed to govern every aspect of their lives. At school, he learned about American history and democratic ideals that seemed to have no connection to the authoritarian world of tenement landlords and factory foremen. The contradiction was particularly sharp when Antonio's teacher, Miss Sarah Patterson, talked about equality and opportunity in America. Miss Patterson was a well-meaning young woman from a middle-class family who genuinely wanted to help her immigrant students succeed. But when she spoke about how hard work and education could help anyone achieve the American dream, Antonio thought about his father Giuseppe, who worked harder than anyone he knew but could barely keep his family fed and housed. These contradictions weren't lost on the tenement children, who developed a sophisticated understanding of how the world actually worked versus how adults claimed it worked. They learned to navigate multiple realities simultaneously: the official version of American opportunity that they heard in school and the harsh truths of economic exploitation that they witnessed at home. The seasonal rhythms of tenement life added another layer of hardship to already difficult circumstances. Summer brought stifling heat that made the overcrowded buildings almost unbearable, but it also brought work opportunities as construction and shipping activities increased. Families could sometimes earn enough during the busy summer months to build small reserves that might help them survive the winter. Winter, however, was a time of crisis for most tenement families. Construction work disappeared, shipping slowed, and the demand for manufactured goods declined. At the same time, the costs of heating and food increased dramatically. Families that had managed to get by during the summer months found themselves facing impossible choices between rent, food, and fuel for heating. The winter of 1893 was particularly brutal, as an economic depression that had started with bank failures in the spring deepened into the worst economic crisis the country had yet experienced. Factories closed, construction stopped completely, and even the casual labour that many tenement men depended on became almost impossible to find. The O'Sullivan family watched their meagre savings disappear within weeks. Patrick had been out of work for 2 months, trudging through snow-covered streets every morning looking for any opportunity to earn a few cents. The docks were frozen, construction had stopped entirely, and even the rag-picking work that had sustained families like the Rossis became impossible as people stopped throwing away anything that might have value. By February, the O'Sullivans were 3 months behind on rent. Murphy, the rent collector, had stopped making his usual threats about eviction because he knew that throwing families into the street during a blizzard would likely kill them, and dead tenants couldn't pay back rent. Instead, he kept a careful ledger of who owed what, calculating interest and fees that would trap families in debt for years to come. Bridget O'Sullivan made a decision that would have been unthinkable just months earlier. She began selling their possessions, starting with the few items of jewellery she had brought from Ireland. Her wedding ring, a simple band that had belonged to her grandmother, brought enough money to buy bread for a week. Patrick's good coat, the one he had worn to Mass every Sunday, purchased coal for 10 days of heating. But the most heartbreaking sale was their family Bible, written in Gaelic and filled with the names and dates of O'Sullivan ancestors going back 5 generations. Bridget carried it to a pawn shop on Delancey Street, where the owner offered her 50 cents for what he called foreign writing that nobody can read. Those 50 cents bought milk for baby Michael and medicine for Timothy's worsening cough, but the loss of that Bible felt like erasing their family's entire history. The psychological impact of selling these treasured possessions went far beyond their monetary value. Each item represented a connection to their former lives, to a time when the O'Sullivan family had owned land and livestock and enjoyed the respect of their neighbours. Watching these pieces of their identity disappear into pawn shops and second-hand stores felt like watching their humanity being stripped away piece by piece. Other families in their building were making similar desperate choices. The Kowalski family from Poland sold their daughter Anna's confirmation dress to buy food. The Morettis from Naples pawned the tools that Giovanni had used in his trade as a cobbler, effectively ending any hope he had of starting his own shoe repair business. Each family's private tragedy played out behind closed doors, creating a building full of people who were too proud or too ashamed to acknowledge how completely the system had broken them. The children absorbed these lessons in powerlessness with devastating clarity. Young Mary O'Sullivan stopped asking when she could return to school because she understood that education had become an impossible luxury. Instead, she spent her days caring for her baby brother while her mother searched for any kind of work that might bring in a few cents. At 13, Mary had already learned that her dreams and ambitions mattered less than her family's immediate survival. Timothy O'Sullivan's cough had developed into something much more serious by the spring of 1894. The 7-year-old boy had lost so much weight that his clothes hung loose on his small frame, and the persistent fever left him weak and confused. Bridget knew the symptoms. She had seen tuberculosis kill her own brother back in Ireland. But knowing what was wrong didn't make treatment any more accessible. The free clinic at Bellevue Hospital had a waiting list that stretched for weeks, and families had to arrive before dawn to have any hope of seeing a doctor the same day. Bridget made that journey repeatedly, carrying Timothy in her arms through the crowded streets, only to be turned away when the doctors ran out of time or supplies. The few private doctors who would treat tenement patients demanded payment in advance, amounts that represented more money than the O'Sullivan family saw in months. So Timothy got sicker while his family watched helplessly. The disease that was consuming him had been spread through their building's contaminated air, nurtured by malnutrition and overcrowding, and left untreated because medical care was a commodity that poor people couldn't afford. His illness wasn't just a personal tragedy. It was a predictable outcome of a system that had calculated that some lives were worth saving and others weren't. The summer of 1894 brought a different kind of crisis to the tenements. A cholera outbreak that started in the overcrowded buildings near the waterfront spread rapidly through the interconnected network of tenement districts. The disease thrived in the primitive sanitation conditions that characterize most tenement buildings, where dozens of families shared inadequate toilet facilities and contaminated water supplies. The city's response to the cholera outbreak revealed the deep class divisions that shaped every aspect of life in Gilded Age New York. In wealthy neighborhoods, city workers installed new water mains and improved sewage systems within weeks of the first reported cases. Streets were cleaned daily, garbage was collected promptly, and residents had access to clean water and medical care that could prevent the disease from spreading. In the tenement districts, the response was dramatically different. City officials quarantined entire buildings, trapping healthy families inside with sick ones, and virtually guaranteeing that the disease would spread. No improvements were made to sanitation systems. No additional medical care was provided, and families were left to face the epidemic with the same inadequate resources they had always had. The Benedetto family found themselves trapped in one of these quarantined buildings when their neighbor, Mrs. Chen, developed symptoms of cholera. Health department officials nailed boards across the building's entrance and posted guards to prevent anyone from leaving. Inside, 43 families were imprisoned with a disease that everyone knew was spread through contaminated water and poor sanitation, exactly the conditions that defined their daily lives. Maria Benedetto watched her children's faces change as they realized what the quarantine meant. Giuseppe Jr., now 12 years old, understood that they might all die not from the disease itself, but from the conditions that made the disease inevitable. The building's single water source was already contaminated, the toilet facilities were overflowing, and the garbage that had been accumulating in the hallways created perfect breeding conditions for the bacteria that caused cholera. For 2 weeks, the families in that building lived in a state of suspended terror. Every morning brought the question of who had developed symptoms during the night, whose fever indicated that death was approaching, whose family would be devastated next. The building became a laboratory for studying how quickly disease could spread when people were forced to share contaminated air, water, and living spaces with no possibility of escape. Giuseppe Benedetto organized the men in the building to demand better conditions during the quarantine. They petitioned the health department for clean water, for removal of garbage, for basic medical supplies that might help families care for sick relatives. Their requests were ignored or denied, not because the resources weren't available, but because city officials had decided that the lives of tenement dwellers weren't worth the expense of proper public health measures. The quarantine finally ended when Mrs. Chen and 3 other residents had died, when the immediate crisis had passed, and when the health department declared that the building was no longer a threat to public safety. The families were allowed to leave, but nothing had been done to address the underlying conditions that had made the cholera outbreak inevitable in the first place. The psychological impact of the quarantine lingered long after the boards were removed from the building's entrance. Children who had watched neighbors die from preventable diseases developed an understanding of their own expendability that no child should ever have to carry. Adults who had begged for basic medical care and been ignored learned that their government viewed them as problems to be contained rather than citizens to be protected. But perhaps the most devastating lesson was about the arbitrary nature of who lived and who died. Mrs. Chen's death hadn't been the result of personal failings or bad decisions. It had been the predictable outcome of a system that provided clean water to some neighborhoods and contaminated water to others, that offered medical care to families who could afford it and left others to face deadly diseases with no help at all. The alcohol trade that flourished in tenement districts represented another form of exploitation that preyed on desperation and despair. Saloons opened on nearly every corner, offering temporary escape from the grinding poverty that defined daily life for most residents. These weren't just businesses. They were carefully calculated operations that extracted money from people who could least afford to spend it, while providing a service that the tenement system made almost essential. Patrick O'Sullivan had never been a heavy drinker back in Ireland, where alcohol was expensive and social drinking was regulated by community expectations and family responsibilities. But in New York, after months of unemployment and watching his family's situation deteriorate, the saloon on the corner of their block became one of the few places where he could escape the constant weight of failure and hopelessness. For 5 cents, Patrick could buy a glass of whiskey that would dull the pain of watching his son Timothy waste away from tuberculosis. For another 5 cents, he could stay in the saloon's warm interior for hours, avoiding the cold tenement room where his family's desperation was impossible to ignore. The saloon offered something that his home couldn't provide: temporary relief from the awareness of how completely the system had defeated him. But those 10 cents represented nearly an hour of Patrick's wages when he could find work. Money spent on whiskey was money not spent on food for his children, medicine for Timothy, or coal to heat their freezing room. The temporary escape that alcohol provided came at the cost of making his family's situation even more desperate, creating a cycle that was almost impossible to break. The saloon owners understood this dynamic perfectly. They weren't just selling alcohol. They were selling hope, community, and temporary dignity to men who had been stripped of all three by the tenement system. The saloon stayed open long hours, offered credit to regular customers, and created an atmosphere of camaraderie that made desperate men feel less alone in their struggles. Mickey Flanagan, who owned the saloon where Patrick O'Sullivan spent his evenings, had once been a tenement dweller himself. He understood exactly how to exploit the psychological needs of men who had lost everything else. His saloon featured pictures of Ireland on the walls, served food that reminded customers of home, and encouraged the kind of storytelling that allowed men to remember versions of themselves that existed before the tenements had broken them. But Mickey's apparent sympathy was really just sophisticated exploitation. He kept careful track of who owed money, charged interest that kept customers in permanent debt, and wasn't above threatening families when men couldn't pay their bar tabs. He had simply found a more profitable way to extract money from tenement dwellers than the landlords and factory owners who employed more direct methods. The women in tenement families bore the brunt of the damage that alcohol abuse inflicted on already struggling households. Bridget O'Sullivan watched helplessly as the money they needed for Timothy's medicine disappeared into Mickey Flanagan's cash register. She saw Patrick retreat further into himself with each passing week, becoming less able to look for work and less capable of providing the emotional support their family desperately needed. For women like Bridget, there were no equivalent escapes available. The saloons were male spaces where women weren't welcome, and the few other forms of entertainment or distraction required money that families couldn't spare. Women were left to manage the practical consequences of their husbands' drinking, explaining to children why there was no food, negotiating with landlords when rent money had been spent on alcohol, and caring for sick family members without the resources that alcohol consumption had consumed. The temperance movement that was gaining strength in middle-class neighborhoods during the 1890s had a complex relationship with tenement districts. Reformers like Francis Willard genuinely wanted to help families that were being destroyed by alcohol abuse, but their solutions often reflected a fundamental misunderstanding of why tenement dwellers turned to drinking in the first place. The temperance activists focused on the moral failings of individual drinkers rather than the systemic conditions that made alcohol seem like the only available escape from unbearable circumstances. They organized prayer meetings and abstinence pledges, but they didn't address the unemployment, overcrowding, disease, and hopelessness that drove men like Patrick O'Sullivan to seek relief in whiskey. More problematically, many temperance activists supported prohibition measures that would have eliminated one of the few sources of pleasure and community available to tenement dwellers without replacing those benefits with anything else. They wanted to remove the saloons without addressing the conditions that made the saloons seem necessary for psychological survival. The settlement house movement represented a different approach to the problems of tenement life, one that attempted to address some of the underlying conditions rather than just treating the symptoms. Jane Addams's Hull House in Chicago had inspired similar efforts in New York, where college-educated young women moved into tenement districts to provide education, social services, and advocacy for immigrant families. Lillian Wald established the Henry Street Settlement on the Lower East Side in 1893, bringing trained nurses and social workers directly into the heart of the tenement district. The settlement house offered English classes, childcare, medical care, and legal assistance to families who had no other access to these essential services. More importantly, it provided a bridge between the isolated world of the tenements and the broader city that surrounded them. Rose Friedman, who had been organizing garment workers for several years, found in the settlement house both resources and allies that strengthened her efforts to improve conditions for working women. The settlement house workers had connections to journalists, politicians, and social reformers who could amplify the voices of tenement dwellers in ways that isolated individuals never could. But the settlement house movement also revealed the limitations of reform efforts that didn't challenge the fundamental structures creating tenement conditions. The settlement workers could provide individual assistance and advocate for modest improvements, but they couldn't address the economic system that required a large population of desperate workers to function profitably. The nurses from Henry Street's settlement could treat the symptoms of malnutrition and disease, but they couldn't raise wages or lower rents enough to eliminate the poverty that caused those health problems. The English classes could help immigrants navigate American institutions, but they couldn't change the discrimination that limited job opportunities or the housing shortages that trapped families in overcrowded tenements. The settlement house workers themselves were often conflicted about how far their reform efforts should go. Many came from wealthy families and understood that the prosperity of their own class depended partly on the availability of cheap labor that the tenement system provided. They wanted to alleviate suffering, but they weren't necessarily committed to eliminating the inequality that made that suffering inevitable. This tension played out in the relationship between Lillian Wald and the families she served. Wald genuinely cared about improving conditions in the tenements, and she worked tirelessly to provide medical care, education, and advocacy for immigrant families. But she also believed that the solution lay in helping tenement dwellers adapt to American society rather than in changing the structures of that society to be more just. The winter of 1895 tested every family in the tenement districts, but it nearly destroyed the O'Sullivans. Timothy had died in November, his small body finally unable to fight the tuberculosis that had consumed him for over a year. The funeral expenses took the last of their savings and pushed the family deeper into debt to both Mickey Flanagan and Murphy the rent collector. Patrick's grief manifested as a complete withdrawal from family responsibilities. He would disappear for days at a time, returning to their tenement room only when he was too drunk to remember why he had left. Bridget found herself truly alone for the first time since arriving in America, responsible for her surviving children, with no income and no prospect of finding work that would pay enough to keep them housed and fed. The city's charitable organizations were overwhelmed by the number of families facing similar crises. The soup kitchens ran out of food before noon most days, the shelters were filled beyond capacity, and the few jobs available were competed for by thousands of desperate people. Bridget O'Sullivan joined the lines of women waiting outside factories that might hire seamstresses for a few days of piecework. But even when she found work, the wages were barely enough to buy bread. Mary O'Sullivan, now 14, made the decision that would define the rest of her life. Without telling her mother, she applied for work at a match factory that employed young women to dip wooden sticks in phosphorus and package them for sale. The work was dangerous. The phosphorus caused a condition called phossy jaw that rotted workers' faces from the inside, but it paid slightly better than most factory work available to women. When Bridget discovered what Mary had done, her reaction revealed the impossible choices that tenement life forced on families every day. She was simultaneously proud of her daughter's courage and responsibility, grateful for the income that might keep them from eviction, and devastated that a 14-year-old girl had been forced to sacrifice her health and future to keep the family alive. Mary's first day at the match factory introduced her to working conditions that made the Triangle Shirtwaist factory seem pleasant by comparison. The building had no ventilation system, so the air was thick with phosphorus dust that burned workers' throats and lungs. The wooden floors were soaked with chemicals that made walking treacherous, and the lighting was so poor that workers had to strain their eyes to see their work clearly. The other women in the factory ranged in age from 12 to 60, representing 3 generations of families that had been trapped in the same cycle of exploitation. The older women warned Mary about the early symptoms of phosphorus poisoning, taught her tricks for protecting her hands from chemical burns, and explained the informal systems that workers had developed to help each other survive in an environment that seemed designed to destroy them. But what struck Mary most powerfully was the resignation in these women's voices. They had accepted that their health would be destroyed by their work, that their wages would never be enough to escape poverty, and that their children would likely follow them into the same dangerous factories. The fight that Rose Friedman had tried to nurture in garment workers seemed to have been beaten out of the match factory employees by years of exposure to chemicals that slowly destroyed both their bodies and their hope. The match factory experience taught Mary lessons about industrial exploitation that went far beyond anything she could have learned in school. She saw how factory owners used the desperation of tenement families to create working conditions that would have been rejected by any workers with other options. She learned how industrial accidents were covered up, how workers were fired for complaining about safety hazards, and how the legal system protected employers rather than employees. More importantly, Mary began to understand how the tenement system and the factory system worked together to create a population of workers who had no choice but to accept whatever conditions were imposed on them. The overcrowded housing, the inadequate wages, the lack of education and healthcare, all of these combined to ensure that people like her family would remain trapped in cycles of exploitation that benefited the factory owners and tenement landlords. The summer of 1896 brought a heat wave that killed hundreds of people in New York City's tenement districts. The combination of overcrowding, poor ventilation, and temperatures that reached over 100 degrees for weeks at a time created conditions that were literally lethal for the most vulnerable residents: infants, elderly people, and those already weakened by malnutrition and disease. The Benedetto family's 4th-floor apartment became unbearable during the heat wave. With no cross-ventilation and windows that faced directly into other buildings just feet away, their rooms trapped hot air like an oven. Maria Benedetto spent her days carrying buckets of water up 4 flights of stairs, trying to keep her children cool and hydrated. But the building's single water source often ran dry during the hottest parts of the day. Giuseppe Jr., now 14 and working alongside his father in construction, was coming home each evening with symptoms of heat exhaustion that seemed to get worse each day. The construction sites where he worked offered no shade, no rest breaks during the hottest hours, and no protection from the sun that beat down relentlessly on workers who couldn't afford to miss even a single day of wages. The heat wave revealed another dimension of the inequality that shaped tenement life. In wealthy neighborhoods, families escaped to summer homes in the mountains or by the ocean. Those who remained in the city had large houses with cross-ventilation, servants to handle household tasks, and access to ice and other cooling methods that were impossible for tenement families to afford. The tenement dwellers had nowhere to go and no resources to make their situations more bearable. The city's few public parks were overcrowded with desperate families seeking relief. But even these spaces offered little comfort when temperatures remained above 90 degrees throughout the night. Many families slept on fire escapes or rooftops, risking falls and other accidents in their attempts to find cooler air. The death toll from the heat wave was concentrated almost entirely in the tenement districts, revealing how completely the city's response to natural disasters was shaped by class and economic status. The newspapers reported the deaths as tragic but inevitable, as if the extreme mortality rates in poor neighborhoods were natural disasters rather than the predictable results of housing policies that prioritized profit over human safety. But some tenement dwellers refused to accept that their suffering was inevitable. Rose Friedman, now a veteran organizer with years of experience building networks among working women, saw the heat wave as an opportunity to demonstrate how collective action could address problems that individuals couldn't solve alone. Rose organized groups of women to demand that the city provide cooling stations in tenement districts, that landlords install basic ventilation improvements, and that employers modify working conditions during extreme heat. The demands weren't revolutionary, but they represented a direct challenge to the assumption that tenement dwellers should simply endure whatever conditions were imposed on them. The campaign achieved modest successes. A few cooling stations were opened. Some employers agreed to provide water and shorter shifts during heat waves, and several landlords made minor improvements to ventilation systems. But the real victory was in demonstrating that tenement dwellers could organize effectively and that their collective voice could force even reluctant authorities to respond to their needs. The heatwave campaign also revealed something important about the psychology of tenement life. When people understood that their individual struggles were part of larger patterns, when they saw that organized action could produce real improvements, the hopelessness that the system depended on began to crack. Not everyone was ready to join organized resistance, but more people began to question whether their suffering was really as inevitable as they had been told. By 1897, the tenement districts of New York City had become laboratories for testing the limits of human endurance. Nearly 2 million people were crowded into buildings that had been designed to house perhaps half that number, living in conditions that violated every principle of public health and human dignity that the city claimed to uphold. The statistics tell part of the story. Infant mortality rates that approached 50% in some neighborhoods, tuberculosis rates that were 10 times higher than in wealthy districts, life expectancy that was nearly 20 years shorter for tenement dwellers than for middle-class New Yorkers. But behind these numbers were individual stories of families who had come to America seeking opportunity and have found instead a system of exploitation more thorough and systematic than anything they had experienced in the old country. The tenement system had evolved into something more sophisticated and more destructive than simple neglect or indifference. It was a carefully maintained structure that extracted maximum profit from human desperation, while maintaining just enough hope and just enough mobility to prevent complete despair from turning into organized rebellion. The wealthy families whose fortunes were built on tenement rents and sweatshop labor maintained their distance from the suffering that funded their mansions and social gatherings. They employed property managers and factory foremen to handle the unpleasant details of exploitation, allowing them to enjoy the profits while maintaining plausible deniability about the methods used to generate those profits. The middle class, caught between the extremes of wealth and poverty, often supported reform efforts that promised to improve conditions without challenging the fundamental structures that created those conditions. They wanted to help the deserving poor while maintaining the economic arrangements that provided their own comfort and security. The tenement dwellers themselves were divided by language, ethnicity, religion, and the constant competition for scarce resources that the system deliberately fostered. But despite these divisions, networks of mutual aid and resistance continued to develop, creating the foundation for larger organizing efforts that would eventually challenge not just the symptoms of exploitation but the structures that made it possible. The stories of families like the O'Sullivans, the Benedettos, and the Friedmans were being repeated in thousands of variations across the tenement districts. Each family faced their own specific combination of hardships and opportunities, but all were shaped by the same fundamental reality: that they lived in a society that had decided their lives were worth less than the profits that could be extracted from their desperation. The children who grew up in these conditions absorbed lessons about power, justice, and human value that would shape their understanding of the world for the rest of their lives. Some, like Rose Friedman, would use these lessons to fuel decades of organizing for social justice. Others, like Mary O'Sullivan, would carry the scars of tenement life into adulthood, their possibilities limited by childhood exposure to industrial toxins and educational deprivation. The tenement system of New York's Gilded Age represented more than just bad housing or temporary poverty. It was a deliberate creation of an economic structure that required human suffering to function profitably, that treated families as commodities to be exploited rather than citizens to be protected, and that maintained itself through a combination of economic desperation and political powerlessness that made resistance seem impossible. But resistance was never completely impossible, and the seeds of change that were planted in the tenement districts during the 1890s would eventually grow into movements that transformed not just housing conditions, but the entire relationship between labor and capital, between citizens and government, between individual suffering and collective action. The transformation that began in the tenement districts during the late 1890s didn't happen overnight, and it certainly didn't happen without fierce resistance from the powerful interests that profited from human misery. But by 1898, something fundamental had shifted in the psychology of tenement life. The passive acceptance that had characterized earlier generations of immigrants was giving way to a more assertive understanding of rights and possibilities. This change manifested itself in unexpected ways. Take the story of Mikhail Petrov, a Russian immigrant who arrived in New York in 1896 with skills as a carpenter, but found himself working in a furniture factory for wages that barely covered rent on a single room he shared with two other men. Mikhail had grown up in a village where craftsmen were respected members of the community, where his father's woodworking skills had provided the family with status and economic security. In New York, those same skills were reduced to repetitive factory tasks: cutting identical pieces of wood, sanding surfaces to machine-perfect smoothness, assembling furniture that he would never be able to afford himself. The factory owner, a German immigrant who had arrived 20 years earlier and worked his way up from poverty, now employed over 50 men in conditions that he himself would have found intolerable when he was starting out. But Mikhail brought something to the tenement districts that hadn't been there before: experience with workers' organizations from the old country. In Russia, he had belonged to a craftsmen's guild that regulated working conditions, set fair wages, and provided mutual support when members faced hardship. These organizations had been brutally suppressed by the Tsarist government, But the idea of collective action hadn't died with the organisations themselves. Working alongside Italian stoneworkers, Irish longshoremen, and Jewish garment workers, Mikhail began to see possibilities for organising that crossed ethnic and language barriers. The furniture factory where he worked employed men from 8 different countries, speaking 6 different languages, but they all understood the universal language of exploitation. Wages that couldn't support families, working conditions that destroyed health, and treatment that denied their basic human dignity. The breakthrough came when the factory owner, Heinrich Müller, announced that he was cutting wages by 10%, while simultaneously increasing the required daily output by 20%. Müller justified these changes by pointing to increased competition from factories that used even more exploitative labour practices, essentially arguing that his workers should be grateful that their exploitation wasn't worse than it could be. Mikhail's response revealed how much tenement life had changed since the early 1890s. Instead of accepting Müller's decision as inevitable, he called a meeting of all the factory workers for the following Sunday. Instead of organising along ethnic lines, he reached out to workers regardless of their country of origin. And instead of asking for modest improvements, he demanded that the wage cuts be reversed and that workers have a voice in decisions that affected their lives. The meeting took place in the basement of St. Bridget's Catholic Church, with Father O'Brien's reluctant permission. 43 men crowded into a space meant for half that number, representing the factory's entire workforce. They spoke in a mixture of English, Italian, German, and Russian, with those who were bilingual serving as translators for the others. What emerged from that meeting was something unprecedented in the history of New York's tenement districts. A multi-ethnic labour organisation that focused on immediate, practical improvements rather than abstract political theories. The men agreed to stop working until Müller reversed the wage cuts and agreed to negotiate future changes with worker representatives. More importantly, they agreed to support each other's families during the strike, pooling resources to ensure that no one's children would go hungry because of their collective action. The strike lasted 3 weeks and ultimately forced Müller to restore the original wages, though he refused to agree to ongoing worker participation in management decisions. But the real victory wasn't the wage restoration, it was the demonstration that tenement dwellers could organise effectively across ethnic lines, and that solidarity could overcome the divisions that employers had deliberately fostered. The success of Mikhail's organising efforts inspired similar actions in other industries throughout the tenement districts. Bakery workers, led by a Polish immigrant named Stanislaw Kowalski, organised to demand shorter hours and protection from the extreme heat of industrial ovens. Laundry workers, mostly Irish and German women, struck for better wages and safer working conditions in the steam-filled buildings, where they spent 12-hour days washing clothes for middle-class families. These individual strikes were important, but they were part of a larger transformation in how tenement dwellers understood their relationship to the economic system that surrounded them. The fatalistic acceptance that had characterized earlier immigrant generations was being replaced by a more assertive sense of rights and possibilities. Rosa Martinez arrived in New York from Spain in 1897, bringing with her experience from anarchist organizations that had been fighting for workers' rights in Barcelona and Madrid. Unlike many immigrants who tried to leave their political activities behind when they came to America, Rosa saw the tenement districts as fertile ground for the same organizing strategies that had been developing in European industrial cities. Rosa found work in a cigar factory on the Lower East Side, where over 200 women spent their days rolling tobacco leaves into cigars that sold for prices that represented more than these women earned in a week. The work required skill and concentration, but it was treated as unskilled labour that could be performed by anyone desperate enough to accept starvation wages. The factory was owned by Samuel Goldman, a successful businessman who had built his fortune by understanding exactly how to exploit the desperation of immigrant women. Goldman paid his workers by the piece, creating an incentive system that forced women to work faster and longer to earn enough money to survive. He employed children as young as 10 to sort tobacco leaves and carry finished cigars, paying them even less than the adult women while exposing them to the same health hazards. Rosa's organizing approach was different from anything that had been tried before in the tenement districts. Instead of focusing on immediate economic demands, she helped the cigar factory workers understand how their individual struggles connected to larger patterns of exploitation that affected working people throughout the city and around the world. The women in Goldman's factory came from dozens of different countries and backgrounds, but Rosa helped them see that their specific experiences of exploitation were variations on universal themes: employers who prioritize profit over human welfare, economic systems that treated workers as disposable commodities, and political structures that protected the wealthy while ignoring the suffering of the poor. This broader understanding didn't make the immediate problems any less urgent, but it gave the women a framework for understanding why individual solutions, working harder, complaining less, accepting whatever conditions were imposed, would never address the fundamental sources of their oppression. The cigar factory strike that Rosa organized in the spring of 1898 became a model for labor organizing throughout the tenement districts. Instead of simply demanding higher wages, the striking women articulated a comprehensive vision of workers' rights that included safe working conditions, reasonable hours, protection for child workers, and recognition of their right to organize and bargain collectively. The strike also demonstrated new tactics that proved more effective than traditional work stoppages. The women organized consumer boycotts, convincing retail stores throughout the city to stop selling cigars produced under exploitative conditions. They reached out to middle-class women's organizations, explaining how the cheap goods that middle-class families enjoyed were produced by workers whose children went hungry so that other people's children could have luxuries. Most importantly, they connected their specific struggle to broader movements for social justice that were developing throughout the United States and Europe. The cigar factory strike wasn't just about wages and working conditions. It was part of a larger challenge to economic arrangements that required human suffering to generate private profit. The strike lasted for 6 weeks and ultimately won significant improvements in wages, working conditions, and recognition of the workers' right to organize. But its real significance lay in demonstrating that tenement dwellers could articulate sophisticated critiques of the economic system and organize effective resistance that went far beyond immediate workplace issues. Samuel Goldman's response to the strike revealed how the tenement system was beginning to adapt to new forms of resistance. Instead of simply trying to break the strike through force or intimidation, Goldman attempted to divide the workers by offering better terms to some, while maintaining exploitative conditions for others. He tried to exploit ethnic divisions by suggesting that Spanish workers like Rosa were outside agitators who didn't understand American conditions. When these tactics failed, Goldman moved his factory to a different neighborhood and recruited new workers who were even more desperate than the women who had organized against him. This strategy of geographical mobility allowed employers to escape organized workers while maintaining the same exploitative practices in new locations. But the organizing networks that had developed during the cigar factory strike proved more durable than Goldman had anticipated. Rosa Martinez and the other strike leaders maintained connections with workers throughout the tenement districts, creating information networks that could warn new workers about exploitative employers and provide support for organizing efforts in different industries and neighborhoods. The winter of 1898 tested these new organizing networks in ways that revealed both their strengths and their limitations. An economic recession that began in the fall eliminated thousands of jobs throughout the city, creating levels of unemployment and desperation that approached those of the devastating winter of 1893. But the response was dramatically different from what had happened 5 years earlier. Instead of families facing crisis in isolation, the mutual aid networks that had grown out of various strikes and organizing campaigns provided coordinated support that helped many families survive without completely destroying their dignity or their hope. Anna Kowalski, whose husband Stanislaw had led the bakery workers' organizing efforts, found herself coordinating food distribution for dozens of families when the bakery closed during the recession. The basement of their tenement building became an informal community center where families shared resources, organized childcare, and planned collective strategies for finding work and housing. This kind of mutual aid wasn't charity in the traditional sense. It was a form of solidarity that recognized that individual families' problems were really collective problems that required collective solutions. When the Petrov family couldn't pay rent because Mikhail had been blacklisted by furniture manufacturers for his organizing activities, other families in their building contributed money and helped negotiate with the landlord to prevent eviction. These networks also provided emotional and psychological support that was just as important as the material assistance. Tenement life had always been isolating, with families struggling privately with problems that seemed too overwhelming to share. The organizing efforts of the late 1890s created spaces where people could acknowledge their struggles without shame and work together to address problems that no individual family could solve alone. The children growing up in these organized tenement communities absorbed very different lessons about power, solidarity, and possibility than earlier generations had learned. Instead of accepting exploitation as inevitable, they watched their parents successfully challenge unfair conditions. Instead of seeing themselves as powerless individuals, they grew up understanding that collective action could produce real improvements in people's lives. 14-year-old Giuseppe Benedetto Jr. had been working in construction alongside his father since he was 12, but by 1898 he was also attending evening classes organized by the settlement houseworkers and participating in youth organizing activities that Rosa Martinez had started for children of striking workers. Giuseppe's dual experience, working in exploitative conditions during the day while learning about workers' rights and organizing strategies in the evening, gave him a sophisticated understanding of how the tenement system functioned and how it might be changed. He could see the connections between his father's exhausting construction work, his mother's struggle to keep their family fed and housed, and the broader economic arrangements that made both forms of suffering profitable for other people. This generation of tenement children would become the leaders of labor organizing efforts in the early 20th century, bringing to those struggles both intimate knowledge of working-class conditions and strategic understanding of how collective action could challenge even well-established systems of exploitation. The year 1899 brought new challenges that tested the resilience of the organizing networks that had developed throughout the tenement districts. A series of industrial accidents in factories throughout the city killed dozens of workers and injured hundreds more, revealing how little had actually changed in the basic safety conditions that workers faced every day. The most devastating of these accidents occurred at a textile factory in Brooklyn, where a fire that started in a pile of fabric scraps spread rapidly through a building that had no fire escapes, inadequate exits, and windows that had been nailed shut to prevent workers from taking unauthorized breaks. 23 women died in that fire, most of them immigrants from Eastern Europe, who had been working 12-hour shifts in conditions that violated every principle of industrial safety. The factory owner, Robert Henderson, the same William Henderson who had owned tenement properties earlier in the decade, expressed regret about the tragedy, but insisted that he had followed all applicable safety regulations and that the fire was an unavoidable accident. The city's investigation concluded that no criminal charges were warranted, and Henderson received a modest fine that represented less than one day's profit from his factory operations. But the response from the tenement districts was swift and coordinated in ways that would have been impossible just 5 years earlier. Rosa Martinez, Mikhail Petrov, and other organizers who had built networks during the various strikes of the late 1890s immediately began planning a response that would go far beyond traditional expressions of sympathy or calls for modest safety improvements. Within a week of the fire, representatives from dozens of different factories, tenement buildings, and ethnic communities had come together to demand comprehensive changes in industrial safety regulations, enforcement mechanisms that would actually hold employers accountable for dangerous conditions, and compensation for families who had lost breadwinners in preventable accidents. The organising campaign that grew out of the textile factory fire demonstrated how much the tenement districts had changed since the early 1890s. Instead of accepting industrial accidents as inevitable tragedies, workers and their families articulated sophisticated analyses of how profit-driven decision-making created dangerous conditions, and how political systems that protected employers made those conditions difficult to change. The campaign also revealed new forms of solidarity that crossed not just ethnic lines, but also the traditional boundaries between different types of workers. Factory workers, construction labourers, domestic workers, and even some small shopkeepers joined together in demanding changes that would protect all working people, not just those in specific industries or neighbourhoods. Margaret Sullivan, Mary O'Sullivan's younger sister, had started working in a shirtwaist factory at age 13, following the path that economic necessity had carved out for most tenement children. But Margaret's experience was shaped by the organising networks that had developed during the 1890s, and she brought to her work a sense of rights and possibilities that earlier generations of child workers had never possessed. When the foreman at Margaret's factory tried to lock the exit doors during working hours, the same practice that had contributed to the deaths in the Brooklyn textile fire, Margaret organised her fellow workers to refuse to work under those conditions. The protest lasted only one day, but it forced the factory owner to keep the exits unlocked and install additional safety equipment that made the workplace significantly safer for all employees. Margaret's successful organising effort was remarkable, not just because she was so young, but because it demonstrated how quickly and effectively the lessons learned in earlier struggles could be applied to new situations. The networks, tactics, and strategic understanding that had been developed through years of organising were now being passed on to a new generation of workers who could build on earlier successes while adapting to changing conditions. The success of these various organising efforts began to attract attention from political figures who recognised that the tenement districts represented a significant and increasingly organised voting bloc. Theodore Roosevelt, who had served as police commissioner in New York City before becoming governor of New York State, understood that traditional approaches to managing urban poverty were becoming less effective as tenement dwellers became more politically sophisticated. Roosevelt's response was to support modest reforms that would address some of the most egregious conditions in tenement housing and industrial workplaces, while preserving the fundamental economic arrangements that made those conditions profitable. His approach represented a new form of political management that offered limited improvements in exchange for continued acceptance of basic inequality. The Tenement House Law of 1901, which Roosevelt supported as governor, required new buildings to meet minimum standards for ventilation, sanitation, and fire safety. Existing buildings were supposed to be improved to meet some of these standards, though enforcement mechanisms remained weak, and many landlords simply ignored requirements that would reduce their profit margins. For families like the Benedettos, who had been living in the same fourth-floor tenement room for over a decade, the new law brought modest improvements: better lighting in hallways, installation of fire escapes, and improvements to the building's water system that provided more reliable access to clean water. But the law also revealed the limitations of reform efforts that didn't challenge the fundamental economics of tenement ownership. Landlords who were required to make safety improvements simply passed those costs onto tenants in the form of higher rents, making housing even less affordable for families who were already spending more than half their income on rent. The law's most significant impact was psychological rather than practical. It represented official acknowledgement that tenement conditions were unacceptable and that government had some responsibility to protect tenants from the worst forms of exploitation. This acknowledgement legitimized the organising efforts that had been demanding these changes and encouraged tenement dwellers to continue pressing for additional improvements. Rosa Martinez understood both the importance and the limitations of the 1901 Tenement House Law. She supported the specific improvements it required while arguing that much more fundamental changes were necessary to address the root causes of tenement conditions. Her approach reflected a strategic understanding that had developed through years of organizing, that modest reforms could be stepping stones toward more comprehensive changes if they were combined with continued organizing and pressure from below. The cigar factory where Rosa worked had closed during the 1899 recession, but she had found new employment in a garment factory that produced clothing for middle-class women. The working conditions were similar to what she had experienced before: long hours, low wages, dangerous machinery, and supervisors who treated workers as disposable commodities. But Rosa's approach to these conditions was informed by nearly 5 years of organizing experience. Instead of simply enduring exploitation or organizing isolated protest workplace to the broader organizing infrastructure that had developed throughout, she immediately began building networks that connected the tenement districts. Within months of starting work at the garment factory, Rosa had established connections between the women who worked there and organizers in dozens of other workplaces. When the factory owner tried to speed up production by requiring workers to operate 2 sewing machines simultaneously, Rosa was able to coordinate a response that involved not just her own factory, but garment workers throughout the city. The 1900 garment workers' strike became the largest and most successful labor action in the history of New York's tenement districts. Over 8,000 workers from more than 50 factories participated in a coordinated work stoppage that lasted for 6 weeks and ultimately won significant improvements in wages, working conditions, and recognition of workers' right to organize. The strike's success demonstrated how the organizing infrastructure that had developed during the 1890s could be mobilized to address industry-wide problems rather than just workplace-specific issues. The networks of mutual support, the strategic understanding of how to build public support, and the tactical knowledge of how to maintain solidarity during extended struggles. All of these elements came together to produce a level of worker organization that employers had never faced before. The strike also revealed how tenement organizing had evolved beyond traditional labor issues to encompass broader questions of social justice and human dignity. The striking workers demanded not just better wages and working conditions, but also recognition of their right to decent housing, education for their children, and participation in the political decisions that affected their lives. Samuel Goldman, the cigar factory owner who had moved his operations to escape organized workers, found himself facing similar organizing efforts in his new location. The networks that Rosa Martinez and other organizers had built proved capable of following exploitative employers wherever they tried to relocate, creating a level of coordination that made it increasingly difficult for individual employers to escape worker organization by simply moving to new neighborhoods. Goldman's response was to join with other employers in developing new strategies for defeating worker organization. Instead of competing with each other for the most exploitable workers, employers began coordinating their responses to strikes and organizing efforts, sharing information about worker organizers, and collectively developing tactics for dividing and defeating organized workers. This employer coordination represented a significant escalation in the conflict between organized workers and the business interests that profited from tenement conditions. The individual struggles that had characterized earlier periods were giving way to more systematic confrontations between organized workers and organized employers, with each side developing increasingly sophisticated strategies and tactics. The police played an increasingly important role in these confrontations, generally supporting employers against organized workers while maintaining the pretense of neutral law enforcement. During the 1900 garment workers' strike, police arrested hundreds of striking workers on charges of disturbing the peace, intimidating replacement workers, and violating various ordinances that were selectively enforced against labor organizers. Mikhail Petrov, who had become one of the most respected organizers in the tenement districts, was arrested 3 times during the garment workers' strike, charged with crimes that ranged from blocking sidewalks to inciting riot. The charges were eventually dropped, but the arrests served their intended purpose of disrupting organizing activities and intimidating other workers who might consider joining the strike. The use of police power to protect employers against organized workers revealed how the tenement system was embedded in broader structures of political and economic power that extended far beyond individual landlords and factory owners. The same government that claimed to protect all citizens equally was systematically using its power to protect the interests of property owners against the interests of working people. But the police repression also demonstrated the growing strength and sophistication of tenement organizing. The networks that had been built during the 1890s proved capable of adapting to increased repression, developing new tactics for maintaining communication and coordination even when key organizers were arrested or intimidated. Rosa Martinez spent 2 weeks in jail during the garment workers' strike, charged with conspiracy to commit violence after she gave a speech calling for solidarity among striking workers. Her imprisonment became a rallying point for the strike, with thousands of workers demonstrating outside the jail and demanding her release. When Rosa was finally released, her first public appearance was at a rally attended by over 5,000 workers from throughout the tenement districts. Her speech that evening summarized how much had changed since she had arrived in New York just 3 years earlier, and it outlined a vision for continued organizing that would address not just immediate workplace issues, but the broader structures of inequality that shaped tenement life. Rosa's speech marked a turning point in the history of tenement organizing. The defensive struggles that had characterized the 1890s, fighting against wage cuts, unsafe conditions, and exploitative practices, were giving way to more proactive efforts to fundamentally reshape the economic and political arrangements that made exploitation possible. The year 1901 began with a level of organization and solidarity among tenement dwellers that would have been unimaginable just a decade earlier. The mutual aid networks, the multi-ethnic labor organizations, the strategic understanding of how to build and maintain collective action. All of these elements had combined to create a social movement that was beginning to challenge not just specific abuses, but the entire system that made those abuses profitable. The children who had grown up watching their parents organize and struggle were now becoming adults with their own understanding of how to fight for justice and dignity. They brought to their organizing efforts both intimate knowledge of tenement conditions and strategic sophistication that had been developed through years of collective struggle. But they also faced new challenges as the economic and political systems that benefited from tenement exploitation developed new methods for containing and defeating organized resistance. The confrontations that would define the early 20th century were already taking shape, with organized workers and their allies on one side, and organized employers and their political supporters on the other. The stories of individual families like the O'Sullivans, the Benedettos, and the Friedmans had become part of larger narratives about collective struggle and social transformation. Their personal experiences of exploitation and resistance were now connected to broader movements that were challenging fundamental assumptions about power, justice, and human dignity in American society. The tenement districts that had been designed to warehouse desperate workers had instead become laboratories for developing new forms of solidarity and resistance. The conditions that were supposed to break people's spirits had sometimes produced exactly the opposite result, creating communities of mutual support and collective action that proved more resilient and more threatening to established power than anyone had anticipated. The transformation that began in New York's tenement districts during the early 1900s would be tested by forces that no amount of organizing could have fully prepared these communities to face. The massive wave of immigration that had been building throughout the 1890s reached unprecedented levels after the turn of the century, bringing nearly 1 million new arrivals to New York City between 1900 and 1905 alone. These new immigrants came from regions that previous waves had barely touched, vast numbers from the collapsing Russian Empire, including Jews fleeing pogroms, Poles escaping economic devastation, and Lithuanians seeking any alternative to the grinding poverty of their homeland. They arrived to find a tenement system that was already stretched beyond any reasonable capacity, operated by landlords who had learned to extract maximum profit from human desperation, and managed by a political system that treated overcrowding as an inevitable fact of urban life rather than a crisis requiring immediate intervention. Elena Volkov stepped off the immigrant ship at Ellis Island in March of 1902, carrying her 18-month-old daughter Katya and everything she owned in a canvas sack that had belonged to her dead husband. Elena had been a schoolteacher in a small town outside Kiev, respected in her community and capable of supporting herself and her child through her education and skills. But the pogrom that killed her husband and destroyed her school had also eliminated any possibility of rebuilding her life in Russia. Elena's first glimpse of her new home came when she followed the address her husband's cousin had sent her to a 7-story tenement on Orchard Street. The building housed over 300 people in spaces that had been designed for perhaps 100. Elena and baby Katya were assigned to share a single room with 2 other families: the Kowalskis, who had been in America for 6 years, and the newly arrived Morettis, who spoke no English and had been in the building for less than a week. The room measured 8 feet by 10 feet. It contained 2 sets of bunk beds, a small table, 1 chair, and a corner where families could store their few possessions. There was no window. The room opened onto one of those fetid air shafts that had become the defining feature of tenement architecture. The only light came from a gas fixture that the families had to pay for separately, and which they could afford to use for only a few hours each evening. Elena's first night in America was spent lying on a straw mattress on the floor, holding Katya close, while listening to the sounds of hundreds of other people trying to sleep in similar conditions throughout the building. The crying of babies, the coughing of sick adults, the arguments between family members who had no privacy and no space to escape from each other. All of this echoed through the thin walls and created a constant din that made rest nearly impossible. But what struck Elena most powerfully wasn't the physical discomfort. She had expected that life in America would be difficult at first. What shocked her was the systematic nature of the degradation she encountered. Every aspect of the building seemed designed not just to house people cheaply, but to strip them of dignity and hope. The single toilet in the basement, shared by dozens of families, was rarely cleaned and frequently overflowed. The water that came from the building's one spigot was often brown and always questionable. The hallways were kept deliberately dark to save money on gas lighting, forcing residents to feel their way along walls that were damp with condensation and covered with grime. Elena had arrived during one of the most profitable periods in the history of New York's tenement industry. Landlords had discovered that the constant stream of new immigrants meant they never had to worry about empty rooms or declining rents. Families that complained about conditions could be evicted immediately, knowing that 3 other families would compete for their space before the day was over. Murphy, who still collected rent for William Henderson and dozens of other landlords throughout the Lower East Side, had refined his system of exploitation to maximize both profits and control. He charged new immigrants premium rates for the worst accommodations, knowing that language barriers and desperation made it nearly impossible for them to negotiate or complain effectively. Families like Elena's paid $15 a month for floor space in rooms that rented for $12 when occupied by a single family. The mathematics of this system were breathtaking in their efficiency. Henderson's tenement on Orchard Street, which had cost him $8,000 to purchase and convert 5 years earlier, was now generating over $700 per month in rent. After paying Murphy's commission, property taxes, and minimal maintenance costs, Henderson was clearing nearly $600 monthly from that single building, a return on investment that exceeded anything he could have earned through legitimate business activities. But Henderson's profits came at a cost that was measured in human suffering on a scale that challenged comprehension. Elena Volkov had been an educated woman who spoke 3 languages and had managed a classroom of 30 children with skill and patience. In the tenement, she was reduced to competing with dozens of other desperate women for piecework that paid starvation wages, sewing garments in the dim light of her shared room, damaging her eyesight and developing the curved spine that came from hunching over needlework for 12 hours a day. The work Elena found was with a clothing contractor who specialized in exploiting the most vulnerable recent immigrants. Isaac Goldberg had arrived from Poland 15 years earlier and worked his way up from sweatshop laborer to small businessman by understanding exactly how to profit from the desperation of people like Elena. Goldberg would contract with larger manufacturers to produce garments at prices that seemed competitive, then subcontract the actual work to women like Elena for wages that made those low prices profitable. Elena's first assignment was sewing buttonholes in men's vests, work that required precision and speed, but paid only 2 cents per vest. Working from dawn until midnight, Elena could complete perhaps 60 vests on a good day, earning her slightly over $1 for nearly 18 hours of labor. But the work was irregular. Some weeks Goldberg had no contracts. Other weeks he demanded that Elena complete impossible quantities of work to meet shipping deadlines. The irregularity of the work made budgeting impossible for families that were already living on the edge of survival. Elena never knew from week to week whether she would earn enough to pay her share of the room rent, buy food for herself and Katya, or purchase the thread and other supplies that Goldberg required her to provide for her own work. The uncertainty created a constant state of anxiety that made every decision, whether to buy milk for Katya, whether to burn coal for heating, whether to see a doctor when the baby developed a fever, into a potentially catastrophic gamble. The psychological toll of this uncertainty was as devastating as the physical hardships. Elena had grown up in a world where education, hard work, and moral behavior led to respectability and security. In the tenement, she discovered that none of these qualities mattered if you lacked the economic power to enforce basic human dignity. Her education was worthless because she was competing for work with women who would accept any wage rather than see their children starve. Her work ethic was exploited by contractors who understood that desperation eliminated any possibility of negotiating fair terms. Her moral standards were constantly challenged by a system that rewarded ruthlessness and punished compassion. Baby Katya's development during their first year in America reflected the devastating impact of tenement conditions on the most vulnerable residents. At 18 months, when they arrived, Katya had been a healthy, curious child who was beginning to walk and speak in both Russian and the few English words Elena had taught her. By her second birthday, Katya had developed the pale complexion and stunted growth that marked tenement children, the result of malnutrition and lack of sunlight in their windowless room. The child's constant illness became another source of impossible choices for Elena. When Katya developed a persistent cough that sounded disturbingly similar to the tuberculosis that was killing people throughout their building, Elena faced a decision that no mother should ever have to make. Taking Katya to the free clinic meant losing a full day of piecework, income that Elena needed to pay rent and buy food. But ignoring the child's symptoms might mean losing her daughter to a disease that was entirely preventable with proper medical care and nutrition. Elena chose to take Katya to the clinic, joining a line of desperate parents that stretched for 3 blocks outside Bellevue Hospital. They waited for 8 hours in the cold March air, Katya growing weaker and more feverish with each passing hour, only to be told that the doctors had run out of time and they should return the following day. The next day brought the same result, and the day after that. By the time Elena finally got Katya in front of a doctor, nearly a week had passed, and the child's condition had deteriorated dramatically. The doctor's examination revealed what Elena had feared: early signs of tuberculosis, along with malnutrition and several other conditions that were endemic among tenement children. But the doctors prescribed treatment, better food, clean air, rest, and medication, required resources that Elena couldn't possibly afford. The medicine alone cost more than Elena earned in 2 weeks of piecework, and the recommended diet of fresh milk, meat, and vegetables was completely beyond her financial reach. So Elena watched helplessly as her daughter grew thinner and weaker, knowing exactly what needed to be done, but unable to do it. This experience taught her something about the tenement system that went beyond simple exploitation. It was a structure designed to make love itself a source of suffering. The more Elena cared about her daughter, the more painful it became to watch her deteriorate from preventable causes. The winter of 1903 brought new levels of desperation to the tenement districts as the economic recession that had started the previous fall deepened into a full depression. Construction work disappeared entirely, manufacturing orders declined dramatically, and even the piecework that had sustained families like Elena's became almost impossible to find. The city's charitable organizations were overwhelmed by the number of families facing complete destitution, and the few jobs that remained available were competed for by thousands of desperate people. Eleanor's situation became critical when Isaac Goldberg's contracting business failed in January, leaving her without any source of income just as winter reached its most brutal phase. The room she shared with the Kowalskis and Morettis had no heat source except for a small coal stove that the families could no longer afford to operate. Ice formed on the inside walls, and water left in containers overnight would freeze solid despite being indoors. The three families huddled together for warmth, sharing their few blankets and taking turns holding the children closest to the stove during the brief periods when they could afford to burn a small amount of coal. Elena's education and former status as a teacher meant nothing in this struggle for basic survival. She was just another desperate mother trying to keep her child alive through a winter that seemed designed to kill the poor. The crisis forced Eleanor to consider options that would have been unthinkable just months earlier. Other women in the building had turned to prostitution, selling their bodies to men who could afford to pay for warmth and temporary companionship. The money was better than piecework. A single night could earn what Elena had made in a week of sewing. But the physical and psychological costs were devastating. Elena ultimately chose a different path that revealed both her desperation and her determination to maintain some control over her fate. She began teaching Russian and basic literacy to other immigrant families, charging 5 cents per lesson and holding classes in the building's basement during the few hours when the space wasn't being used for other purposes. The income was minimal, but it allowed Eleanor to use her education rather than simply enduring its irrelevance. The teaching work also connected Eleanor to families throughout the building in ways that revealed the hidden networks of mutual support that sustained tenement communities during their darkest periods. Parents who couldn't afford to pay for lessons would offer other forms of assistance, watching Katia while Elena searched for additional work, sharing food when they had any to spare, or providing information about job opportunities and housing alternatives. These networks weren't organized in any formal sense, but they represented a form of collective resistance to the isolation and hopelessness that the tenement system was designed to create. When families helped each other survive, they were challenging the assumption that poverty was an individual failing that required individual solutions. When they shared resources and information, they were building alternatives to the competitive desperation that landlords and employers depended on to maintain their control. Elena's basement teaching classes gradually evolved into something more than simple literacy instruction. As immigrant families struggled to understand the legal and bureaucratic systems that govern their lives in America, Elena found herself explaining everything, from rental agreements to employment contracts to citizenship requirements. Her classroom became an informal community center where people could discuss their problems collectively and develop strategies for addressing challenges that seemed impossible to handle individually. The spring of 1903 brought new possibilities as the economic depression began to lift and work became available again throughout the city. But Elena's experience during the winter had changed her understanding of what survival in America required. She had learned that individual effort, no matter how determined, was insufficient to protect her family from the systematic exploitation that defined tenement life. When clothing manufacturers began hiring again, Elena sought out Rosa Martinez, whose reputation as an organizer had spread throughout the immigrant community. Elena understood that joining organized resistance efforts involved risks. Employers blacklisted known organizers, landlords evicted troublemaking tenants, and the police arrested workers who challenged authority too openly. But she also understood that accepting exploitation passively offered no real security, only the certainty of continued suffering. Rosa's organizing approach had evolved significantly since her early days in the cigar factory. She now worked with a network of organizers throughout the tenement districts, coordinating efforts that addressed not just workplace issues, but the entire range of problems that immigrant families faced. Housing conditions, healthcare access, education for children, protection from crime and exploitation. All of these were understood as interconnected issues that required comprehensive solutions. Elena's first organizing meeting took place in the same basement where she had been teaching literacy classes. But now the space was filled with women from dozens of different buildings and ethnic backgrounds. Rosa led a discussion that helped participants understand how their individual struggles connected to larger patterns of exploitation that affected working people throughout the city and beyond. The meeting revealed something that Elena had begun to suspect during her months of teaching, that immigrant families possessed far more knowledge and capability than the tenement system allowed them to use. The women in that basement spoke multiple languages, had managed complex family and community responsibilities in their home countries, and understood sophisticated strategies for survival and mutual support. Their supposed ignorance and helplessness were really products of a system that made their skills and knowledge irrelevant to their immediate survival needs. Rosa's organizing strategy focused on helping people understand that their capabilities could be mobilized collectively to challenge the structures that kept them trapped individually. Instead of simply demanding better treatment from employers and landlords, organized tenement dwellers could develop alternative institutions that met their own needs while building power for more fundamental changes. The first concrete project that emerged from Eleanor's organizing involvement was a cooperative childcare arrangement that allowed mothers to work more regular hours while ensuring that their children received better care than was possible in the overcrowded tenement rooms. Elena used her teaching skills to provide basic education for children whose parents couldn't afford to send them to school, while other women contributed childcare, food preparation, and connections to healthcare resources. The cooperative represented something unprecedented in the tenement districts, an institution created and controlled by working-class immigrants that provided better services than anything available through private markets or government programs. The children in Elena's care received more attention, better nutrition, and more educational opportunities than they could have gotten through any other available option. But the success of the cooperative also attracted attention from authorities who viewed any form of independent organization among tenement dwellers as a potential threat to established order. The health department began making unannounced inspections, claiming to be concerned about sanitation and safety in unlicensed childcare facilities. The police questioned Eleanor about her activities, suggesting that unauthorized teaching might violate various regulations about education and business licensing. These interventions revealed how the tenement system was embedded in broader structures of control that extended far beyond individual landlords and employers. The same government that claimed to protect all citizens equally was systematically undermining efforts by working-class immigrants to improve their own conditions through collective action. Elena's response to this harassment demonstrated how much she had learned about power and resistance during her 2 years in America. Instead of backing down or trying to make her activities less visible, she worked with Rosa Martinez and other organizers to document the harassment and build public support for the childcare cooperative. They reached out to settlement house workers, sympathetic journalists, and middle-class reform groups who could provide political protection for their organizing efforts. The campaign to defend the childcare cooperative became a rallying point for broader organizing throughout the tenement districts. The specific issue, whether working mothers had the right to organize cooperative childcare, connected to fundamental questions about democracy, economic justice, and the rights of immigrants to participate fully in American society. The confrontation escalated when city officials threatened to close the cooperative and arrest Elena for operating an unlicensed school. Rosa Martinez organized a demonstration that brought over 2,000 people to City Hall, demanding recognition of working families' right to organize institutions that met their own needs. The demonstration was unprecedented in its size and diversity, bringing together immigrants from dozens of different ethnic communities, along with their supporters from settlement houses, labor organizations, and reform groups. The success of the demonstration forced city officials to negotiate rather than simply shutting down the cooperative through police action. The final agreement allowed the childcare program to continue operating while requiring minimal licensing procedures that Elena and her collaborators could easily meet. More importantly, the campaign established the principle that tenement dwellers had the right to organize alternative institutions and that government harassment of such efforts would face organized resistance. Elena's transformation from isolated immigrant mother to community organizer reflected broader changes that were occurring throughout the tenement districts during the early 1900s. The defensive struggles that had characterized earlier periods were giving way to more proactive efforts to build alternative institutions and challenge fundamental assumptions about power and democracy in American society. The childcare cooperative that Elena had helped create became a model for similar efforts throughout the immigrant community. Women organized cooperative kitchens that provided better food at lower cost than anything available through individual shopping. Families pooled resources to rent larger spaces that could be shared more efficiently than the tiny rooms that individual families were forced to accept. Workers created mutual aid societies that provided support during illness, unemployment, and other crises that the existing social safety net couldn't address. These cooperative institutions represented more than simple economic alternatives. They were experiments in democratic participation that gave working-class immigrants experience in collective decision-making and self-governance that the broader political system denied them. Elena found herself participating in debates about budgets, policies, and priorities that were far more meaningful to her daily life than the electoral politics from which she was excluded as a non-citizen. The skills that Elena developed through her organizing work, public speaking, negotiation, strategic planning, coalition building, were exactly the capabilities that the tenement system was designed to prevent working-class immigrants from developing. Her transformation from powerless victim to effective organizer represented a direct challenge to assumptions about the capabilities and rights of poor people that justified their continued exploitation. By 1904, Eleanor had become one of the most respected organizers in her section of the Lower East Side, working with Rosa Martinez and others to coordinate activities that involved hundreds of families across dozens of tenement buildings. But her success also made her a target for intensified harassment from landlords, employers, and government officials who understood that effective organizing represented a genuine threat to the systems they controlled. William Henderson, who still owned the building where Eleanor lived, began looking for pretexts to evict her and other families involved in organizing activities. Murphy, his rent collector, started demanding payment in advance, claiming that organizers were poor credit risks who might skip out on their rent obligations. When Elena couldn't pay 3 months' rent in advance, Henderson initiated eviction proceedings that would have left her and Katya homeless in the middle of winter. The eviction attempt backfired spectacularly when Elena's organizing networks mobilized to defend her right to remain in her home. Hundreds of people gathered outside the tenement building when the sheriff arrived to carry out the eviction, creating a human barrier that made it impossible to remove Elena's possessions without risking a riot. The demonstration attracted media attention that exposed Henderson's harassment tactics and generated public sympathy for organized tenement dwellers. More importantly, the successful defense of Elena's housing established a precedent that landlords couldn't simply evict organizers without facing organized resistance. The networks that had been built around childcare cooperatives and mutual aid societies proved capable of mobilizing quickly and effectively to protect their members from retaliation. Eleanor's victory in the eviction fight marked a turning point in her understanding of what collective organization could accomplish. The same system that had seemed omnipotent when she faced it as an isolated individual became vulnerable when challenged by coordinated resistance from organized communities. The landlords, employers, and government officials who had appeared all-powerful were revealed to depend on the passivity and isolation of their victims to maintain their control. The lessons Eleanor learned through her organizing experiences were being absorbed by thousands of other immigrants throughout the tenement districts. The networks that connected different buildings, different ethnic communities, and different types of workers were creating new forms of solidarity that crossed traditional boundaries and challenged established hierarchies. Katya Volkov, now 4 years old, was growing up in an environment dramatically different from the one that had nearly killed her during her first years in America. The childcare cooperative provided her with better nutrition, healthcare, and educational opportunities than would have been available to her as the child of an isolated immigrant mother. But more importantly, Katya was absorbing lessons about collective action and mutual support that would shape her understanding of the world for the rest of her life. The child was learning that problems that seemed impossible for individuals to solve could be addressed successfully through organized effort. She watched her mother and other adults work together to create institutions that met their own needs, rather than simply accepting whatever services were provided by others. She saw that ordinary people could challenge authority effectively when they worked together strategically and persistently. These lessons were being learned by an entire generation of tenement children who would carry forward the organizing traditions that their parents had developed through years of struggle. The defensive battles that had characterized the 1890s were evolving into more comprehensive efforts to transform the economic and political structures that made tenement conditions possible. Elena's story illustrates how individual experiences of immigration and tenement life were being transformed through collective organizing into broader challenges to established power. Her journey from isolated victim to effective organizer reflected possibilities that were opening up throughout the tenement districts as immigrant communities developed new forms of solidarity and resistance. The tenement system that had been designed to warehouse desperate workers was producing exactly the opposite of what its creators had intended. Instead of isolated, desperate individuals competing against each other for survival, the overcrowded conditions were fostering community networks and collective institutions that provided alternatives to market-based solutions and government services. The year 1905 would bring new challenges and opportunities that would test the strength and durability of these organizing networks. The massive immigration that continued to pour into New York City created both additional strain on already overcrowded conditions and new sources of energy and capability for organizing efforts. The economic boom that characterized the mid-1900s provided more work opportunities, while also increasing the profits available to landlords and employers who continued to exploit working-class immigrants. Elena's organizing work had connected her to networks that spanned the entire tenement district and included connections to labor organizers, political reformers, and social movement activists throughout the city and beyond. These connections provided resources and strategic understanding that individual tenement communities could never have developed on their own. But the success of tenement organizing was also generating new forms of resistance from the powerful interests that profited from existing conditions. Employers were developing more sophisticated methods for defeating organized workers. Landlords were finding new ways to exploit housing shortages, and government officials were creating new mechanisms for controlling and containing immigrant communities. The confrontations that would define the next phase of tenement organizing were already taking shape, with organized immigrant communities on one side and increasingly organized opposition from employers, landlords, and their political allies on the other. The individual stories of families like Elena and Katya Volkov had become part of larger narratives about democracy, justice, and human dignity that would reshape American society in ways that none of the participants could have fully anticipated. The basement meetings that Elena organized had grown into regular assemblies that brought together representatives from dozens of tenement buildings throughout the Lower East Side. These gatherings had evolved far beyond their original focus on childcare and mutual aid to address the full range of issues that affected immigrant families: workplace exploitation, housing conditions, healthcare access, education, police harassment, and political representation. The discussions that took place in these assemblies revealed the sophisticated political understanding that tenement dwellers had developed through years of organizing experience. Participants analyzed connections between local problems and broader economic structures, developed strategic plans for addressing multiple issues simultaneously, and created accountability mechanisms that ensured their organizations remained responsive to the needs of their members. Elena found herself serving as a bridge between different ethnic communities that had historically been isolated from each other by language barriers and cultural differences. Her ability to speak Russian, Polish, and English, combined with her teaching experience and organizing skills, made her an effective translator not just of languages, but of different approaches to collective action that various immigrant groups had brought from their home countries. The organizing networks that Elena helped coordinate were developing capabilities that extended far beyond anything that individual tenement communities could have accomplished alone. When garment workers in one neighborhood went on strike, they received support from childcare cooperatives, mutual aid societies, and tenant organizations throughout the district. When landlords tried to evict organizing families, they faced resistance from networks that could mobilize hundreds of people within hours. These coordinated efforts were beginning to produce results that challenged fundamental assumptions about power relationships in American society. Employers who had never before been forced to negotiate with organized workers found themselves facing demands that they couldn't simply ignore or suppress.